Some stories end, but a few refuse to die. Tonight, before sleep takes you, I want to show you something extraordinary. How a forgotten village beside a quiet river became the engine that built our calendars, our laws, our languages, our cities, and somehow still lives inside the world we wake up in every morning. Rome did not just rise, it reshaped reality. It did not just fall, it echoed for 2,000 years, carried by kings, churches, soldiers, storytellers, and by the bricks beneath our feet. So lie back, slow your breath, and step with me into a world where emperors believed they were gods, where armies marched beyond the horizon, where a single idea became stronger than time itself. This is the entire story of the Roman Empire, not the version you learned in school, the real one, the one that kept the world awake for centuries. And tonight, it's yours.
The story of the Roman Empire does not begin with marble or armies or emperors wrapped in purple cloth. It begins in a quiet place, on the banks of a river that was not yet famous, at a time when the world felt larger and more mysterious, and human footsteps were only beginning to echo across the Mediterranean landscape. Before Rome became a symbol of power, law, and civilization, it was simply another settlement among many, a cluster of huts perched on 7 low hills overlooking the steady flow of the Tiber River. If you stood there, centuries before the marble and glory, you would see nothing that hinted at the future. Just soft wind moving through grasses, shepherds guiding their flocks, and small fires glowing at dusk. The world was old, but Rome was young, almost invisible, waiting for the long story to begin. It is in this early half-imagined age that the tale of Romulus and Remus takes shape, a story whispered by poets and priests long before historians tried to sift fact from myth. According to legend, twin brothers, sons of the war god Mars and a mortal woman, were left to die by the order of a fearful king. The basket that carried them drifted along the Tiber until it caught among reeds, where a she-wolf found the crying infants and nursed them as her own. Whether this happened or not is less important than what it symbolizes. The belief that Rome was born from struggle, abandonment, survival, and an almost supernatural determination. The twins grew, overthrew the man who had tried to destroy them, and set out to build a city on the hills that had once sheltered them. But even this early moment is marked by blood because, when the brothers disagreed on where the walls should rise, Romulus killed Remus. Rome, from its first breath, carried the weight of ambition and the shadow of violence. The city was founded, so the story says, on April 21st, 753 BCE, a date later Romans celebrated with pride. But the true beginning was quieter, more human, more fragile. In those first years, Rome was not the mighty empire people imagine today. It was a small kingdom surrounded by other tribes who were older, richer, and more confident than this new settlement. The hills were dotted with wooden huts, the streets were dirt, and the people were farmers, shepherds, and traders who mixed their beliefs with the spirits of the land, the river, and the hearth. The earliest Romans worshipped forces rather than faces, gods without clear forms, felt more than seen. And yet, beneath this simplicity lay something that distinguished Rome, a sense of organization, of discipline, of shaping the world with human hands rather than waiting for fate to decide everything. Even in its infancy, Rome carried the idea that people could build something bigger than themselves if they were willing to endure hardship. The early kings of Rome, Romulus, Numa, Tullus, Ancus, Tarquin the Elder, Servius Tullius, and Tarquin the Proud are remembered through fragments of stories, some peaceful, some harsh. Whether these men existed exactly as later writers describe them is uncertain, but the themes they represent are true. Under one king, religious traditions were established, calendars, rituals, sacred boundaries that shaped Roman identity. Under another, wars were fought, the land expanded, and Rome began to push outward, challenging neighboring tribes. Under yet another, walls were built, markets were organized, and the first sense of a city taking shape began to shimmer in the dust and afternoon light. By the time the last king ruled, Rome had grown more confident, but power had also become abusive. Tarquin the Proud ruled harshly, his family feared, his laws heavy. Kingship had once been a stabilizing force, but over generations, ambition corroded it. Rome was ready for change, and the spark came from a tragedy that pushed an entire population toward a new form of government. The story of Lucretia is woven through Roman memory with the force of a moral lesson. She was a noble woman, known for her virtue, who was assaulted by the king's son. When she revealed what had happened, she demanded justice, then took her own life, an act that ignited the anger of her family and the broader Roman people. Her death became a turning point. The monarchy was overthrown, and in its place rose something rare in the ancient world, a republic. Two consuls would rule, sharing power, preventing any one man from holding absolute authority. The idea spread through the streets that decisions should be debated, laws should be written, and power should answer to the people. Rome, slowly, painfully, was learning to govern itself. This new republic was not perfect. Wealthy families, the patricians, held most of the power, while the common people, the plebeians, wanted greater rights, fairer laws, protection from abuses, and a voice in the decisions that affected their lives. Tensions simmered until the plebeians staged what was essentially a mass walkout, leaving the city and refusing to return unless reforms were made. The rich needed the poor as laborers, soldiers, farmers. The compromise that followed became one of Rome's defining features: the creation of the tribune of the plebs, officials elected by the common people with the power to veto unfair decisions. Bit by bit, the republic became more balanced, not through idealism alone, but through conflict and negotiation. Rome was learning that stability requires inclusion, that strength comes from many voices, not just a few. It was a lesson that would return again and again in its long history. But while Rome debated internally, it also looked outward. The city grew not through sudden conquest, but through steady endurance, small wars, alliances, settlements, and patience. The Romans had a reputation for stubbornness, for refusing to give up even when defeat seemed certain. Their early wars against neighboring tribes, the Latins, Sabines, Volsci, Equi, Etruscans, were not glamorous, but they forged something more important than glory. They forged discipline, unity, and a shared identity built through hardship. Rome expanded like a slow-moving but unstoppable tide, absorbing cultures, learning from them, and turning their strengths into Roman strengths. By the 4th century BCE, Rome faced one of its first great trials: the invasion of the Gauls. These warriors from the north swept into Italy with ferocity, defeated the Roman army, and entered the city itself. The senators waited in their chairs, choosing dignity over escape, while the Gauls took the city in an event Romans would never forget. Only the fortified Capitoline Hill held out. Legend says that as the Gauls attempted a night assault, the sacred geese of Juno honked loudly, waking the defenders just in time. Whether or not this happened is uncertain, but the memory remained. The Romans eventually drove the Gauls out, but the humiliation was deep. The city had been burned, the people traumatized, the pride wounded. Yet from this devastation emerged something fierce, a determination to rebuild stronger than before. The Romans did not collapse. They adapted, organized, and rebuilt their defenses. The fire that had consumed their homes ignited a new intensity within them. Rome would rise again, harder, sharper, disciplined, unwilling to let such a disaster happen twice. This moment marked a shift. Rome became more militarized, more strategic. The legions began to evolve into the disciplined machine history remembers. Formations drilled endlessly, soldiers trained to move as one, not for individual glory but for the strength of the unit. The Romans built roads for speed, alliances for stability, and colonies to secure new land. They expanded through a mix of force and diplomacy, offering conquered people a path to citizenship, rights, and identity within Rome. This was unusual. Rather than crush enemies entirely, Rome often absorbed them, turning rivals into Romans. It was a strategy that would help create one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. But before the empire, before Julius Caesar, before Augustus, before the marble and the laws and the Pax Romana, Rome faced one of its greatest tests, the rise of Carthage. The Carthaginians were powerful traders, sailors, and wealthy masters of the Western Mediterranean. Their ships painted the coasts with purple dye from Tyrian snails. Their harbors buzzed with commerce, and their generals were respected across the world. Rome and Carthage were not destined enemies at first, but competition grows where ambition meets opportunity. The island of Sicily became the spark. What followed would be a century of conflict. The Punic Wars, long and bitter, fought on land and sea. The First Punic War was grueling, with Romans learning naval warfare almost from scratch. They built fleets quickly, sometimes disastrously. Storms wrecked entire armadas. But they learned. They invented new boarding devices so their soldiers could turn sea battles into land battles. Slowly, painfully, Rome won. But victory did not end the rivalry. Instead, it deepened it. The Second Punic War brought one of the most legendary figures in history, Hannibal Barca, a general whose name still stirs admiration. He led his army and his war elephants across the Alps in a feat that felt impossible. Snow, ice, cliffs, ambushes. He lost many men, but reached Italy with enough strength to fight some of Rome's worst defeats. At Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and Cannae, Hannibal shattered Roman armies with brilliance and strategy. Cannae alone cost tens of thousands of Roman lives. The Republic seemed on the edge of collapse, and yet, in their deepest moment of crisis, the Romans did something extraordinary. They did not surrender. They refused negotiations. They refused panic. They created new armies, tightened discipline, fortified cities, and avoided Hannibal's traps. Rome bent, but did not break. In the end, Rome outlasted Hannibal through endurance and a counterstrike led by Scipio Africanus, another brilliant general who carried the war into North Africa, forcing Hannibal to return home and face him at the Battle of Zama. Hannibal lost, and with him, Carthage's dominance ended. Rome emerged as the rising superpower of the Mediterranean. These early centuries show a pattern that would shape all Roman history. Rome wins not only through strength, but through persistence, a refusal to accept defeat, a belief in collective identity, a system that adapts, absorbs, improves, and rebuilds. But power also brings new challenges. Wealth poured into Rome after its victories. Luxuries, gold, slaves, spices, art, and knowledge from across the Mediterranean entered the city. What had once been a humble republic of farmers and soldiers became a melting pot of cultures, ambitions, greed, and political tension. The very success that made Rome powerful also began planting the seeds of future instability. As the population grew and the gap between rich and poor widened, unrest began to simmer. Political corruption increased. Powerful families fought for influence, and ordinary citizens sought leaders who could champion their rights. Into this world stepped the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, who tried to pass reforms to help the poor reclaim land and opportunities. Their attempts ended in violence, with both brothers killed, marking a dark turning point in Roman political life. The Republic was cracking, slowly, quietly. The system still functioned, but strain was building, and the future was beginning to shift towards something new. Rome was no longer a small city fighting for survival. It was becoming something larger than any one individual, bigger than the Senate, richer than its traditions could comfortably contain. The Republic had served Rome well, but a storm was forming beyond the horizon. A storm that would bring civil wars, ambitious generals, shifting loyalties, and, eventually, the rise of emperors. In the soft glow of candlelight centuries later, historians would look back at this moment and see the signs: the expanding borders, the unprecedented wealth, the military reforms that made generals more important than politicians, the frustrations of the common people, the fragile balance between Senate and commanders. Rome was heading toward a transformation as profound as its founding. But for now, in this early chapter of the story, Rome stands on the edge of greatness and also on the edge of danger. The river still flows quietly through the city. The hills still watch as people fill the markets, senators argue, soldiers train, and farmers return from the fields at dusk. Life feels normal, ordinary even. No one can yet see the shadows forming, shadows that will eventually shape the rise of men like Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar. No one knows that the Republic, despite its confidence, is walking toward a cliff it cannot yet see. For now, Rome is rising, not falling, and the world watches as a once small settlement becomes the heart of a civilization that would influence the West for thousands of years. This is where the transformation begins. This is where ambition takes root. This is where the Republic grows too large, too powerful, too divided for its old systems to hold. The story of Rome is only getting started, a story that will stretch across continents, across centuries, across emperors and armies, victories and disasters, glory and ruin. But for tonight, for this quiet moment, let the story unfold slowly, like the river beneath the moonlight, steady and calm, carrying us deeper into the world that shaped our own. And so as we drift deeper into the long twilight of the early Roman world, the picture becomes clearer and yet softer around the edges, like a distant landscape painted in the warm, fading light of evening. After the legendary founding of Rome and the rise of the early kings, the young city still stood fragile against the backdrop of the Italian peninsula, an ambitious settlement surrounded by older and wealthier neighbors, each with their own gods, their own grudges, their own memories stretching further back than Rome's modest beginnings. But Rome possessed something unusual, a sort of quiet stubbornness, a willingness to absorb the customs of others, to borrow their techniques, to imitate their strengths, while refusing to forget its own fierce independence. It was a city that learned quickly, sometimes painfully, and grew through friction rather than ease. Families who had plowed small fields now found themselves learning diplomacy, negotiating with Etruscan nobles, bargaining with Latin hill chiefs, and weathering the unpredictable storms of early politics. The downfall of the monarchy was not a single explosion, but a slow accumulation of resentment, tradition, trauma, and ambition. The Roman people, tired of kings who grew too comfortable with power, too accustomed to ruling without answering to anyone, finally exiled their last monarch, Tarquinius Superbus, a man whose very name, the Proud, captures the dangerous arrogance that sealed his fate. His expulsion opened something in the Roman spirit, almost like the first clear breath after a long confinement. From that moment forward, whether in triumph or in suffering, Romans would guard their political freedom with a vigor unmatched by other ancient peoples. They feared kings the way sailors fear hidden reefs, silent, seductive, catastrophic. So the Romans built a republic, not a smooth or perfect system, but a resilient one, where competing voices created equilibrium and where the people, through assemblies and protests and stubborn persistence, kept the powerful from becoming too powerful. The early republic was raw, tense, and full of contradictions. Patrician nobles dominated offices and spoke with the authority of ancestors whose faces were carved into wax masks and displayed every time a family member died. But the plebeians, the workers, farmers, traders, craftsmen, were the spine of the city. Without their labor, without their willingness to march into battle, no Roman dream could survive. And the plebeians knew it. That awareness sparked the first great conflict in Roman politics, the struggle of the orders. Time and again the plebeians walked away from the city, literally marching to the hills to show the patricians how fragile Rome would be if its working heart stopped beating. And each time Rome waited, panicked, negotiated, and finally compromised. Out of these conflicts emerged the tribunes of the plebs, officials without royal crowns, but with extraordinary power, the ability to veto decisions, to protect individual citizens, to stand as guardians of the common voice against the thunder of elite ambition. This balance of tension, this believable mix of cooperation and hostility, became one of Rome's greatest strengths. It sharpened the Roman character, giving rise to citizens who understood not just warfare but law, not just obedience but argument. The Republic learned to adapt, to shift like a seasoned captain steering a ship across unpredictable waves. It built alliances with neighboring Latin towns, sometimes generously, sometimes with the hard edge of negotiation. It fought wars that were less about conquest and more about survival, defending its small territory from Volsci, Aqui, and Etruscan kings, who saw the rising republic as a threat or a prize. Every victory was modest, every setback a reminder of vulnerability. But each year Rome grew a little more experienced, a little more confident, a little more aware of its own identity. And then came the Gallic sack, an event that shook the Roman psyche so deeply that even centuries later Romans spoke of it with a shiver. In 390 BCE, a group of Gauls descended from the north like a storm that no omen had predicted. Rome fought them bravely at the river Allia and lost, disastrously. The Gauls marched into the city, burned homes, desecrated temples, shattered certainties. Only the Capitoline Hill held out, a stubborn knot of resistance perched above the smoking ruins. For months, Rome waited in terror until finally the Gauls accepted a ransom and withdrew. The story, softened in memory yet still trembling with humiliation, left a scar across the Roman soul, a reminder that no city, no matter how proud, was untouchable. And yet from that devastation rose an even more determined Rome, a city that rebuilt itself brick by brick, passed new laws, strengthened its walls, and vowed never again to be caught unprepared. That vow shaped the centuries that followed. Rome became disciplined, strategic, and relentless. It built roads to move armies quickly, standardized weapons and tactics, and turned military service into a powerful tool of social advancement. In that world, the Roman legions evolved from hastily gathered farmers into a machine of astonishing precision. Rome fought the Samnites in long, exhausting wars, battles in mountain passes, ambushes in steep valleys, negotiations that alternated between fragile truces and sudden betrayals. These wars taught Rome mobility, taught it the value of flexibility, taught it how to adapt its battle formations to unforgiving terrain and unpredictable enemies. Bit by bit, Rome emerged from the Italian peninsula not just as a participant in history, but as its choreographer, shaping the fates of peoples who once hardly knew Rome's name. Gradually, the Republic became an expanding organism, absorbing cities, granting partial citizenship, establishing colonies that grew like footprints across the map. Rome offered its allies something rare for the ancient world, a share in its identity. Not equality, no, Rome was far too proud for that, but a path, a ladder, a gradual ascent into the Roman system. This is how Rome turned enemies into partners and partners into Romans. The Italian peninsula slowly transformed into a network of communities tied by roads, law, and obligation, all feeding into the gravitational center of Rome. And then, just as Rome began to feel secure on land, it encountered a rival that ruled the sea, Carthage. A city older, wealthier, and more experienced in maritime trade, Carthage was everything Rome was not: cosmopolitan, ocean-facing, steeped in luxury, and proud of its ancient Phoenician heritage. Their collision was not inevitable at first, but it became unavoidable. When Rome stepped onto the island of Sicily to defend its allies, it entered a world Carthage considered its sphere. The struggle that followed, the First Punic War, lasted more than 20 years, a slow, grinding contest of endurance. Rome, inexperienced in naval warfare, built fleets from scratch, learned through disaster, and returned again and again until Carthage, exhausted and surprised by the Republic's tenacity, finally withdrew from Sicily. But the rivalry was not over, not even close. From this simmering tension rose Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian general, whose name would echo across centuries, like a challenge thrown at the heart of Rome itself. His march across the Alps, one of the most astonishing military feats in history, brought terror to the Italian plains. Hannibal crushed Roman armies with elegance and ferocity, delivering defeats so devastating that Rome seemed on the verge of collapse. Yet the Republic, forged in the fires of past disasters, refused to fold. It endured with a quiet stubbornness that bordered on defiance. Hannibal became a ghostly presence, haunting Italy for over a decade, winning battles, but unable to break the Roman will. Finally, Rome carried the war back to Africa, and in the Battle of Zama, Hannibal's magic faded, and Carthage bowed. This victory changed everything. Rome no longer fought for survival, but for dominance. Its legions grew bold, confident, unrestrained. Its leaders saw new worlds to claim: Greece with its ancient cities and philosophers, the rich kingdoms of the East, the tribal frontiers of Spain and Gaul. Yet with each conquest, the Republic became more complicated, more divided, more wealth-soaked and restless. New fortunes flooded into Rome, reshaping the social order, enriching a few while pushing many into hardship. Veterans returned to find their farms ruined or sold. Politicians gained power not through service but through spectacle. The Republic, once proud of its balanced system, began to crack under the weight of its own success. This unraveling came slowly at first, hidden beneath triumphs and celebrations. But beneath the surface, the foundations loosened. Rival generals raised private armies. Senators schemed. Reformers rose and fell, some with noble intentions, others with vengeance in their hearts. Rome was no longer the humble city fighting for a foothold. It had become the center of a vast and fragile empire. Its citizens tasted wealth, ambition, fear, and possibility all at once. And in this mixture, the calm rhythms of the old republic began to ebb like a tide retreating from familiar shores, signaling an age of turbulence ahead. As Rome expanded into the wider Mediterranean world, the tension between its old republican humility and its new imperial appetite grew sharper, like a rope pulled tight between two distant anchors. The victories against Carthage had reshaped the republic, but they also reshaped Romans themselves. Soldiers who had spent years abroad returned home with stories of strange gods, vibrant markets, gold, spices, and customs that had no place in the quiet rhythm of the old Roman countryside. Others returned to find that their small farms, neglected during long campaigns, had been swallowed by wealthy landowners who turned the Italian fields into vast estates worked by slaves captured in foreign wars. It was as if the victories Rome celebrated with such pride had carried a hidden cost that crept silently beneath the triumphal arches. The very success that raised Rome above the world began to loosen the threads that held its society together. The Senate, once a council of wise elders, became more aristocratic, more isolated from the daily struggles of ordinary citizens. Senators navigated politics like a game played behind closed doors, trading influence, forming alliances, and shaping laws in ways that widened the gap between themselves and the masses who filled the streets and marketplaces. The poorer citizens, many crowded into Rome itself, lived in cramped insula, tall, fragile apartment blocks where wooden beams creaked in summer heat and fires spread quickly in the night. The people depended on grain shipments from faraway provinces, and the slightest disruption, a storm at sea, a pirate raid, a corrupt official, could send fear rippling through the city. And yet Rome glowed with a restless energy, a rising flame that no hardship could extinguish. Markets hummed with languages from 3 continents. Temples rang with prayers to countless gods, and the streets pulsed with ambition, envy, pride, and hope. Amid this growing complexity, certain voices rose with unusual force. The Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, stepped forward like young heralds trying to mend the fractures of a society that did not yet realize how deep its wounds ran. They proposed reforms meant to restore land to the poor, to balance privilege with dignity, to reassert that the Republic served all Romans, not only the richest. But Rome had changed, and power had become a prize, men protected with desperate intensity. The reforms were met with resistance, then hostility, and eventually violence. Tiberius Gracchus was beaten to death in a public riot. A decade later, his brother Gaius met the same fate. Their deaths echoed through Roman memory like the first tremors of a coming earthquake. Rome had crossed an invisible threshold. It had killed its own reformers. And once a republic sheds the belief that political disagreement can be resolved without blood, the path ahead darkens. Rivalry now took on a new shape, fueled not by principled debate but by the personal armies of ambitious generals. One of the first to see the opportunity hidden in Rome's growing military needs was Gaius Marius, a man of humble birth whose talent for command transformed the Roman legions. Marius opened military service to the landless poor, promising them pay, plunder, and a hope of land after retirement. The army swelled, hardened, and became more loyal to its commanders than to the distant and increasingly divided Senate. Marius fought brilliantly against Numidian kings in Africa, against invading tribes in the north, and he was hailed as Rome's savior. But his victories carried a quiet danger. Soldiers now looked to their generals for reward rather than to the republic itself. The bond between citizen and state had subtly shifted, as if Rome had unknowingly planted a seed that would grow into something too vast for anyone to control. The next great figure to emerge from this shifting world was Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a man whose icy ambition cut through the fog of Roman politics with frightening clarity. Sulla and Marius, once allies, became bitter enemies in a rivalry that drove the Republic into open war. Legions marched on Rome, not to defend it but to seize it. Streets that once echoed with festival crowds now ran with blood. Sulla, after winning, appointed himself dictator, rewriting laws, punishing rivals, and reshaping the Republic according to his vision. His reforms were harsh, unforgiving, designed to safeguard Rome from future chaos. But in attempting to save the Republic, he undermined the traditions that had kept it afloat. When Sulla eventually retired, leaving Rome to its fate, he left behind a state that looked the same from a distance but had fundamentally changed. The taboo against force had been broken. The Republic's political system, once resilient enough to survive wars and disasters, had now been altered by men who used armies as political tools. Yet Rome continued to grow. New provinces were claimed, new wealth poured in, and new generations of Romans pushed the limits of ambition even further. Pirates roamed the Mediterranean like swarms of locusts, threatening trade routes, until a rising commander named Pompey swept them away with astonishing speed. In the east, he defeated powerful kings, reorganized entire regions, and returned to Rome with prestige that rivaled the greatest heroes of old. At the same time, Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the wealthiest men in history, built his influence through business, alliances, and a hunger that wealth could not satisfy. And then there was a young politician whose charm, intelligence, and daring made him unforgettable: Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar was unlike any Roman before him. He combined the eloquence of a statesman with the bravery of a soldier, the vision of a reformer with the cunning of a rival. He understood Rome's fears, its desires, and its weaknesses. He knew how to move crowds with a single speech and how to maneuver through the Senate with calculated grace. He saw opportunities where others saw limits. When Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus formed the first triumvirate, a private alliance to dominate Rome, it was as if the Republic had been placed in the hands of three competing storms. For a while, the arrangement worked, holding together by a fragile web of promises, mutual gain, and political necessity. But the Republic was too old and too strained to withstand that kind of pressure for long. When the alliance fractured, the sky darkened. Crassus died in the east, his dreams of glory collapsing in a disastrous campaign. Pompey drifted toward the Senate, seeking authority that matched his fame. Caesar marched into Gaul, where he spent years leading campaigns of staggering scale. His victories there, against tribes, chieftains, and alliances that spanned the forests and rivers of Western Europe, made him more popular than any general before him. The legions adored him. The people of Rome admired him. The Senate feared him. Caesar's rise was no longer a political achievement. It had become a gravitational force, pulling Rome toward a confrontation it could not avoid. When the Senate demanded he surrender his command, Caesar made the decision that would divide history into before and after. He crossed the Rubicon River with a single legion, a symbolic act that declared decision, defiance, and destiny all at once. The civil war that followed was swift, dramatic, and filled with moments that would echo through every century that came after. Pompey fled to Greece. Caesar pursued him. Battles erupted like storms across the Mediterranean world. In the end, Caesar prevailed and the Republic lay in his hands, shaken, wounded, and uncertain whether it had been saved or conquered. But this is where the story deepens, where the edges blur, where the rise of one man becomes the prelude to the rise of an empire that would outlive him by centuries. Caesar held enormous power, yet he spoke of mercy, clemency, stability, and renewal. He passed laws, forgave enemies, reorganized debts, and even planned to overhaul the calendar, a reform so precise that it still shapes the world today. But power, once concentrated, attracts fear. Senators whispered that he aimed to make himself king, the one title Romans had sworn never to revive. Their fear culminated in the Ides of March, when Caesar was stabbed to death by men who believed they were saving the Republic, not realizing they were lighting the fuse for a new era of turmoil. The Republic, wounded again, staggered into a new conflict, a new reshuffling of loyalties, a new generation of ambitions. Caesar's death did not restore the old balance. It shattered it completely. The next chapter, one written by Octavian, Antony, and Cleopatra, would push Rome across the final threshold between republic and empire. The death of Julius Caesar rippled through Rome like a shock wave moving across a vast sea, disturbing every surface and unsettling every foundation. Senators who had expected cheers and gratitude found instead a city frozen between fear and fury. The Roman people, who had loved Caesar with a passionate intensity, mourned him with a raw grief that spilled into the streets, into the forum, into the very walls of the city that had watched his triumphs and now witnessed his fall. Mark Antony, Caesar's closest ally and a man of volcanic charisma, delivered a funeral speech that twisted the knife further into the hearts of the crowd. His words were sharp, emotional, almost theatrical, painting Caesar not as a tyrant, but as a generous leader who had been struck down by treachery. The people responded with anger, setting fire to buildings, hunting for the conspirators, demanding answers in a Rome suddenly stripped of its center. The Republic, already fragile, now trembled under the weight of too many ambitions and too few unifying forces. Into this chaos stepped a young man whom almost no one took seriously at first. Gaius Octavius, Caesar's great-nephew, had been named Caesar's heir in his will. Barely 19 years old, delicate in appearance, sickly in reputation, he seemed an unlikely contender in a world dominated by generals and warriors. Yet beneath his quiet surface lived an extraordinary political instinct, a mind sharper than Antony's sword and steadier than the Senate's wavering loyalty. Octavian, as he would soon be known, understood that power in Rome was no longer about lineage alone. It was about alliances, money, loyalty, perception, and timing. And in each of these he began to move like a player who already knew the rules to a game others barely understood. Antony believed he could control the young heir. The Senate believed they could use him. The conspirators believed he posed no threat. But Rome was a city that rewarded calculation, and Octavian calculated everything. He gathered Caesar's veterans with a mixture of respect and promise. He secured funds. He built support quietly, patiently, always projecting humility while laying foundations for something far greater. Meanwhile, Antony, more impulsive and dramatic, maneuvered aggressively for dominance, expecting Octavian to fall into his shadow. Their alliance cracked almost immediately. The Senate tried to exploit the tension. But Rome had grown too chaotic for clever maneuvers to hold. It needed stronger hands, clearer leadership, and soon the impossible happened. Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus formed the Second Triumvirate, an official three-man rule meant to restore order. The triumvirate began with blood. Prescriptions, lists of enemies to be executed, rolled out across the city like curses inscribed on tablets. Property was confiscated, families ruined, streets filled with fear. Even Cicero, Rome's greatest orator, fell to Antony's hatred. Rome had become a stage for survival, rather than politics, and the triumvirate used its absolute power without mercy. Their main goal, however, was to defeat the conspirators who had murdered Caesar. Brutus and Cassius had fled east and assembled armies, preparing to defend their vision of a restored republic. The resulting clash came at Philippi, a massive battle in the rugged lands of Macedonia. Antony proved himself the stronger general, while Octavian, though sick during the fighting, cemented his growing authority. The conspirators were defeated, their cause extinguished, and the Republican dream slipped further away with every spear thrown and every command shouted across the battlefield. After Philippi, the triumvirate divided the Roman world like a prize. Antony took the east with its wealth, ancient cities, and tangled alliances. Octavian took the west, struggling with veterans demanding land, Italian cities erupting in anger, and political tensions simmering just beneath the surface. Lepidus received Africa, but his influence rapidly diminished, fading like a shadow under brighter lights. It was clear to all that the true struggle for the future would be between Antony and Octavian. Their alliance slowly unraveled, not with sudden violence, but with a drifting series of slights, disagreements, and gestures that revealed how little trust remained between them. Antony's story, once so promising, became increasingly entangled with the magnetic orbit of Cleopatra VII of Egypt. Cleopatra was a queen unlike any other, brilliant, multilingual, politically gifted, and capable of bending the most powerful men in the world toward her interests. Antony met her in Tarsus and found in her not only an ally, but a companion whose presence stirred both admiration and scandal across Rome. He settled in Alexandria, living in a world of Eastern luxury and ceremony that offended Roman sensibilities. Rumors spread that Antony was handing Roman territories to Cleopatra, that he was planning to build an Eastern monarchy, that he no longer cared for Rome at all. Whether these accusations were true or exaggerated did not matter. Octavian understood their value. He used them masterfully, shaping public opinion as if Rome itself were a stage and he the unseen director, placing every actor in position. Octavian needed more than rumors, however. He needed legitimacy. He married Livia, forming a powerful alliance. He positioned himself as the guardian of Roman morality, the defender of tradition, the voice of stability against Antony's supposed decadence. And then he made his boldest move. He acquired Antony's sealed will and revealed its contents, whether truly or partially fabricated, to the Senate and the people. The will claimed that Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria with Cleopatra and that he had granted eastern territories to Cleopatra's children. This, Octavian argued, was proof that Antony had betrayed Rome. Outrage followed, organized but effective, and Rome marched willingly toward war. The final conflict, known as the War of Actium, shaped the destiny of the Mediterranean. Antony and Cleopatra's forces gathered in Greece, waiting for the decisive naval engagement. Octavian, guided by his brilliant Admiral Agrippa, positioned his fleet for victory. When the battle finally erupted, the sea churned with ships, fire, smoke, and shouts. Antony fought with determination, but Cleopatra, seeing the tide turning, retreated with her ships, and Antony followed, abandoning the battle in a moment that would haunt him forever. Their forces crumbled. Octavian's triumph was secured. Antony and Cleopatra fled back to Egypt, hoping to salvage what remained of their power. But Octavian pursued slowly and steadily, tightening the net as if closing the final chapter of a tragedy already written. When his armies approached Alexandria, Antony, broken by defeat and misinformation, took his own life. Cleopatra, refusing to be paraded through Rome as a trophy, followed soon after. Whether by snakebite or poison, no one can say for certain. Their deaths ended not only a romance that Hollywood would one day immortalize, but also the last major obstacle between Octavian and complete control of the Roman world. Rome, exhausted by civil war, looked to Octavian for stability, and he, with extraordinary caution and brilliance, reshaped the Republic into something new without ever declaring it openly. He refused the title of king. He accepted honors only when offered. He claimed to restore the Republic while subtly centralizing all power in his hands. He took the name Augustus, meaning the revered one, and with that name he became the first emperor of Rome. The city that had once exiled kings now embraced an emperor because he promised peace, order, and the end of chaos. Under Augustus, Rome flourished. Roads stretched across continents like veins carrying the lifeblood of empire. Armies secured borders. Provinces prospered. Cities grew. Trade expanded. Art, literature, and architecture reached heights that echoed the glory of the age. Augustus crafted an image of stability so enduring that future emperors, even the most chaotic among them, would still cling to the shadow of his example. The Republic had died quietly, buried beneath titles that disguised its absence. The empire had risen, proud and immovable, with Augustus at its helm. But the story of Rome does not end with the rise of its first emperor. It only widens, deepens, and expands into new territories, new rulers, new triumphs, and new storms waiting on the horizon. With Augustus at the helm of the newly formed empire, Rome entered an age that seemed almost unreal in its calm. After generations of civil war, assassinations, political purges, and shifting loyalties, the sudden arrival of stability felt like waking from a long nightmare into a morning filled with sunlight and clear air. This period came to be known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a stretch of nearly 2 centuries, where Rome's power was so solid, so carefully balanced, that the world under its influence experienced a kind of uneasy serenity. It was not peace without cost, nor did it blanket every corner of the empire equally. But compared to the chaos that had preceded it, the new era felt like a gift placed gently in the hands of history. Augustus governed with restraint, with patience, and with an understanding that appearances mattered as much as decrees. He strengthened institutions while quietly ensuring they could never challenge him. He expanded the empire's borders carefully, securing regions essential for trade, defense, and political symbolism. And he surrounded himself with advisors, poets, architects, and generals, whose talents turned his reign into a symphony of prosperity. Rome itself transformed. The city that once echoed with the noise of political brawls now hummed with construction. Marble replaced brick in many districts. Temples rose with elegant columns that shimmered beneath the Italian sun. The Forum became a stage not only for politics but for art, ritual, and public pride. The great altar of peace, the Ara Pacis, celebrated the stability of the empire and proclaimed that Rome had learned the cost of ambition and chosen to channel it into creation rather than destruction. Roads extended outward like spokes from a wheel, binding the empire into a cohesive whole. Merchants, travelers, and legionaries moved along these routes carrying not only goods but ideas, languages, and customs. The Mediterranean became a Roman lake, a shining body of water dotted with trade ships and galleys ensuring order. Yet beneath the veneer of harmony, Rome still held simmering tensions. An empire built on conquest required constant maintenance. Legions guarded borders where distant peoples watched Rome with suspicion or resentment. Rebellions flared from time to time, some small, others terrifying in their scale. None was more famous or dramatic than the revolt in Judea led by the Zealots, which would later culminate in the destruction of the Second Temple. Even within Rome's heartlands, poverty, class division, and political rivalry did not disappear. Augustus, understanding the fragility of peace, maintained strict control over the legions and kept the Senate carefully balanced between influence and obedience. The imperial household became its own universe of intrigue, where succession was debated not in public elections, but in the private actions of family members, generals, and advisors, whose ambitions were cloaked beneath carefully cultivated loyalty. When Augustus died, his adopted son Tiberius succeeded him, a capable general but a somber, withdrawn ruler. Tiberius never wanted to be emperor. He spent much of his reign wrestling with paranoia and political distrust. Rome, accustomed to the warmth of Augustus's leadership, struggled under the cold shadow of Tiberius's caution. Trials for treason increased. Senators lived in fear of accusations. Yet Rome still functioned, its system strong enough to withstand the mood of a reluctant emperor. After Tiberius came Caligula, a young ruler whose brief reign spiraled into chaos. Stories about him range from the absurd to the horrifying, demanding worship as a god, staging bizarre spectacles, exhausting the treasury, and indulging in cruelty that shocked even hardened Romans. Whether every story is true or exaggerated hardly matters. His rule ended violently when his own guards assassinated him, unable to tolerate the disorder any longer. Following Caligula's death, the Praetorian Guard found Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace, trembling, certain he would be killed. Instead, the guards declared him emperor, a moment that revealed the shifting nature of power in Rome. Claudius, scholarly, awkward, underestimated, proved unexpectedly effective. He reformed the administration, expanded citizenship, and launched the conquest of Britain, bringing new lands and new peoples into Rome's orbit. His reign suggested that the empire's strength lay not only in the brilliance of its rulers, but also in the quiet machinery of governance that could support even unlikely emperors. Claudius's stepson Nero inherited the throne next, and here the story bends again into tragedy. Nero began as an artist, a dreamer who wished to reshape Rome into a city of culture and beauty. But as pressures mounted, he slid into suspicion and excess, eliminating rivals with alarming ease. His rule became a dark theater of intrigue, culminating in the Great Fire of Rome, an event still debated today. Nero rebuilt the city with grandeur, but lost the trust of many Romans. When uprisings spread, Nero fled and ultimately ended his own life, marking the end of the Julio-Claudian line. Rome stood once again on the brink, its future uncertain, its leadership in question. The year that followed Nero's death became known as the Year of the Four Emperors, a violent whirlwind of claims, betrayals, and marching armies. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian each seized the purple in rapid succession. Civil war flared as legions loyal to different commanders clashed across the empire. But out of this turmoil rose stability once more. Vespasian, founder of the Flavian dynasty, restored confidence in practical governance. He financed great building projects, including the Flavian Amphitheater, known to the world as the Colosseum, a structure that would stand as one of Rome's most enduring symbols. His sons, Titus and Domitian, continued the dynasty with mixed reputations. Titus beloved for his generosity and courage, Domitian feared for his sternness and suspicion. Yet even in their differences, the empire continued to function, proving again that Rome's institutions could survive flawed rulers. After the Flavians came the Nerva-Antonine dynasty, an era many historians consider the golden age of the empire. Nerva, chosen for his wisdom, adopted Trajan, a general of immense talent and generosity. Trajan expanded Rome to its greatest territorial extent, conquering Dacia and bringing unimaginable wealth into the empire. His successor Hadrian reversed some of Trajan's expansions but invested deeply in culture, architecture, and border stabilization. Hadrian's wall in Britain remains a testament to his vision of a defensible, sustainable empire. Then came Antoninus Pius, whose peaceful reign was marked by stability and good administration, followed by Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor whose meditations remain among the most profound reflections ever produced by a ruler. Yet even Marcus Aurelius could not prevent the challenges that awaited, including the devastating Antonine Plague and renewed pressures on the frontiers. Rome had reached a peak so dazzling that it was difficult for contemporary observers to imagine decline. The empire felt eternal, a massive, intricate machine spanning continents, ruled by emperors whose authority seemed limitless. But history teaches that every system has limits. Rome had built roads, aqueducts, laws, and cities across thousands of miles, binding diverse peoples into a single political body. This unity gave strength, but it also required constant energy to maintain. In distant provinces, new threats emerged. Germanic tribes grew stronger. Persia, reawakened as Rome's formidable eastern rival, and internally the transitions between emperors became increasingly volatile as succession grew less predictable. Still, for generations, Rome endured, resilient, adaptable, magnificent. It stood not only as a political power but as a cultural force, shaping law, language, architecture, religion, and identity across much of the known world. It was a civilization of contradictions, brutal yet beautiful, disciplined yet extravagant, capable of immense generosity and terrible cruelty. And as the empire continued through the centuries, the pressures of time, invasion, disease, economic strain, and internal conflict began to shape a new path, one that would lead toward transformation rather than simple collapse. As the Roman Empire stepped into the second half of its long life, the signs of strain began to appear gradually, almost imperceptibly, like small cracks forming beneath fresh paint. For most people living through those years, Rome still felt powerful, still felt inevitable, still felt like the natural center of the world. Markets bustled with goods from 3 continents. Legions stood firm on distant frontiers, their standards bright beneath unfamiliar skies. Senators debated, tax collectors measured grain, merchants counted coins, stamped with the emperor's profile. Daily life continued with a rhythm so steady that few could imagine it changing. Yet beneath this steady pulse, deeper forces stirred, forces that would eventually reshape the empire in ways no one could foresee. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, spent much of his life far from the marble halls of Rome, commanding legions on the northern frontiers. The tribes pressing against the Danube were not new, but they were becoming bolder, more organized, and more numerous. Climate shifts and pressures from peoples farther east pushed waves of migrants toward Rome's borders. Marcus, with his calm mind and disciplined heart, tried to manage these challenges while wrestling with the personal grief of losing children and watching disease sweep through the empire. The Antonine Plague, likely smallpox, ravaged cities, emptied fields, and weakened legions. A population once overflowing began to thin. Farms were abandoned. Trade faltered. And though Marcus Aurelius remained steady, his death marked a turning point that many later historians viewed as the beginning of a long downward slope. His son Commodus ascended to the throne, a young man raised in luxury with little interest in the responsibilities of rule. Where Marcus sought wisdom, Commodus sought applause. He fancied himself a gladiator, a performer in the arena, the sort of figure Rome had once admired in myth, but never trusted with real power. His reign became a theater of extravagance, generosity mixed with cruelty, and politics strained beneath the weight of his whims. Assassination ended his rule, plunging Rome into another crisis of succession. What followed? A rapid sequence of emperors chosen by civil war rather than careful adoption, served as a harsh reminder that stability at the top was never guaranteed. In the centuries that followed, Rome's vast size became both its glory and its burden. The frontiers stretched thousands of miles, demanding constant attention. Legions needed food, pay, supplies, and reinforcements, all managed through a system that grew increasingly expensive. As armies gained more influence, generals gained more ambition. More than once, the empire found itself split between rival claimants marching toward Rome at the head of loyal legions. Each civil conflict drained resources and left borders unguarded just long enough for external threats to push inward. The 3rd century became a storm. Emperors rose and fell with dizzying speed, some ruling only months before being assassinated by their own soldiers. Economies spiraled. Coins were debased, losing their silver content. Prices rose. Confidence collapsed. Plagues returned, shaking the population again. And beyond Rome's borders, new power stirred. The Goths, Vandals, and other Germanic peoples tested the weakened defenses. In the east, the Sasanian Persian Empire rose with confidence, reclaiming old territories and even capturing a Roman emperor in battle, a humiliation unthinkable in earlier centuries. Yet for all these crises, Rome refused to die. Its resilience proved astonishing. Out of the chaos came reformers, hard, disciplined men who clawed the empire back from the brink. Among them, none was more important than Diocletian. He understood what few before him had accepted. The empire was too vast, too complex, too stressed to be ruled effectively by a single pair of hands. His solution was radical. Divide the empire between two emperors, each with a junior partner, creating a tetrarchy that shared power while maintaining unity. Administrative reforms strengthened the bureaucracy. Borders were reinforced. Taxes were reorganized. For a moment, the empire regained its footing. But even Diocletian's reforms could not fix the deeper structural issues that had accumulated over centuries. When he retired, the first emperor to ever voluntarily leave power, the system he built began to fray. Ambition and rivalry returned. Civil war flared once more. Yet from this turmoil emerged one of Rome's most transformative figures, Constantine. His victory at the Milvian Bridge, his consolidation of power, and his decision to establish a new capital in the East marked a turning point not just politically, but spiritually. Under Constantine, Christianity moved from a persecuted minority faith to an institution embraced by the emperor himself. Over time, it would reshape the cultural and moral identity of the empire, anchoring it in a new vision of divine order. Constantinople, the new imperial capital, rose on the ancient site of Byzantium, a shining city perched between Europe and Asia, guarded by walls that would become legendary for their strength. As Rome struggled with poverty, depopulation, and political decay, Constantinople grew into a thriving metropolis that symbolized the empire's shift eastward. Greek language, Eastern customs, and Christian theology blended into a new imperial character. Meanwhile, the Western Empire, still Roman, still proud, began to feel the pressure of being overshadowed by its flourishing Eastern twin. The West faced challenges that seemed relentless. Population decline continued, cities shrank, trade networks contracted, wealth concentrated in fewer hands. Aristocrats retreated to fortified villas. Legions once loyal to Roman commanders increasingly relied on federated troops. Barbarian soldiers invited to serve Rome in exchange for land and autonomy. It was a practical solution born of necessity, but it planted seeds of future fragmentation. The Goths, seeking safety from the Huns, crossed into the empire with permission but soon clashed with Roman officials. Mismanagement turned refugees into rebels. The disastrous Battle of Adrianople, where the Eastern Roman emperor was killed by Gothic forces, sent shock waves through the empire. Rome had suffered defeats before, but this loss signaled a shift in the balance of power. The Western Empire staggered forward, propped up by temporary alliances, charismatic generals, and delicate diplomacy. Meanwhile, the East continued to strengthen, better positioned economically, militarily, and administratively. Rome, once the beating heart of a vast world, became more symbolic than central, a city still revered, but increasingly unable to shape events beyond its walls. Emperors came and went, often controlled by powerful generals or court factions. The machinery of governance creaked under the strain. Yet through all this, ordinary life persisted. Markets still opened. Farmers still harvested grain. Children still played in the shadow of ancient monuments. Christianity spread, weaving new rituals into daily life while ancient temples fell quiet. Latin evolved. Laws were rewritten. Rome remained Rome, even as the world around it shifted in ways its founders could never have imagined. By the time the Western Empire reached the final decades of its official life, the question many asked was not when it would fall, but what falling even meant. Rome had transformed so many times. Monarchy to republic, republic to empire, pagan rituals to Christian rites, marble city to half-deserted capital. The collapse seemed like just another stage in a long metamorphosis. And when the moment finally came, it did not arrive with a single shattering blow, but as a quiet transfer of symbols from one pair of hands to another. The final act of the Western Roman Empire unfolded not with a dramatic crash, but with a slow weakening, like a great ancient oak losing strength year by year, its roots still gripping the earth, even as its branches hollowed. For generations, the empire managed to survive blows that might have ended lesser nations. It negotiated with tribes along its borders, hired them as soldiers, absorbed them into its villages, and tried to weave them into the fabric of Roman life. But the world was changing. Peoples who had once lived far beyond the frontiers were now pressing inward, pushed by their own fears and ambitions, carrying families, herds, traditions, and memories of long journeys. Rome, stretched thin, could no longer command them the way it had commanded the world centuries earlier. The Visigoths were among the first to force themselves into Roman consciousness. Seeking refuge from the swift and terrifying advance of the Huns, they crossed the Danube hoping for safety. Mismanagement and corruption by Roman officials turned desperation into hostility. What might have been peaceful resettlement became rebellion. The Visigoths marched through the Balkans, clashed with Roman forces, and at the Battle of Adrianople shattered a Roman army led by the emperor himself. For the first time in living memory, Rome could not dismiss such a defeat as an unfortunate skirmish. It had been a catastrophe, and the empire felt the tremor in every direction. In the decades that followed, Rome alternated between fragile peace and renewed conflict. Generals like Stilicho, half Roman, half Vandal, struggled to keep the Western Empire intact, fighting off threats from within and without. But even he could not stop the tide permanently. The Visigoths, led by Alaric, marched toward Italy repeatedly, demanding recognition, land, and dignity. Rome refused, hesitated, negotiated, broke promises, and in the end pushed Alaric to take the unthinkable step. In the year 410, the city of Rome, untouched by enemy hands for nearly 800 years, was sacked. The shock rippled across the known world. To many, it felt as though the lights of civilization had flickered. Yet even then, Rome did not collapse. The city endured. The empire endured. The East strengthened its grip on survival. The West rebuilt and continued, though its wounds deepened. New threats rose in North Africa, where the Vandals established a kingdom after marching across the Mediterranean lands with brutal determination. The loss of Africa Rome's breadbasket, the source of much of its grain, was a devastating economic blow. Meanwhile, the Huns, under their formidable leader Attila, surged into the heart of Europe, threatening both Eastern and Western Rome. Though they never conquered the imperial cities, the terror they inspired reshaped the political landscape. Their presence forced Rome to rely more heavily on federated tribes for defense, blurring the lines between Roman armies and foreign warriors. As the 5th century advanced, the Western Empire became a world where emperors were figureheads more often than leaders. Power shifted to generals, to warlords, to ambitious commanders who used the imperial court as a theater for their own rivalries. Families who once commanded armies in the name of Rome now carved out private power networks. Amid this turbulence, ordinary Romans lived lives suspended between the familiar and the uncertain. Markets still opened each morning. Bakers still kneaded dough. The rituals of the Christian church replaced older ceremonies. Children still studied Latin, though fewer imagined themselves serving in an imperial bureaucracy that no longer held the same future it once promised. The final years of the Western Empire narrowed around a handful of men whose actions determined its fate. Among them was Orestes, a Roman general with influence but little stability behind him. He placed his son, the young Romulus Augustus, on the throne, a child emperor ruling a realm held together mostly by habit. Facing him was Odoacer, leader of federated soldiers who had served Rome faithfully, but now demanded land in Italy as payment. When their demands were refused, they moved against Orestes. Romulus Augustulus surrendered without resistance. Odoacer did not kill him. Instead, he sent the boy into comfortable retirement, a symbolic gesture that showed how exhausted the old order had become. In 476, the Western imperial title was sent to Constantinople, acknowledging that there was no longer a separate Western emperor. But even this moment felt less like a collapse, and more like an admission of a truth long visible. Yet while the Western Empire dissolved politically, Roman identity did not vanish. It flowed into the kingdoms that replaced the empire: Visigoths in Spain, Ostrogoths in Italy, Franks in Gaul, each absorbing Roman law, Roman customs, Roman language, Roman dreams. Latin did not vanish. It evolved into the languages of Europe. The church preserved scholarship, rituals, and memories of imperial unity. Roads remained. Walls remained. The habits of Roman governance remained. Rome's body faded, but its spirit spread wide across the continent it had shaped for centuries. Meanwhile, in the East, the empire continued. More Greek than Latin, more Christian than pagan, more medieval than ancient. Modern historians call it the Byzantine Empire, but the people living within its walls called it simply the Roman Empire, because to them that identity never ended. Constantinople became a beacon of culture, wealth, and learning. Its walls, thick and layered, stood unbroken against invaders for 1,000 years after the fall of the West. Its scholars copied ancient texts, debated theology, and refined laws. Its emperors ruled over a shrinking but resilient world, adapting to centuries of change with surprising tenacity. This Eastern Roman Empire would survive waves of enemies: Persians, Bulgars, Arabs, Crusaders, Turks, each leaving scars, but never extinguishing the flame entirely. Even when the empire lost vast territories, even when court intrigues grew poisonous, even when plague swept through its streets, Constantinople remained a city of golden domes and sacred relics, a place where echoes of Rome's ancient past mingled with the chants of Christian liturgy. It stood as a reminder that not all endings are final. Some are simply transitions. Back in the former Western lands, new kingdoms emerged from the ruins of the old. The Franks forged an empire under Charlemagne that briefly revived dreams of Western unity. The British Isles developed their own patterns of rule. Spain became a mosaic of Christian and Muslim realms. Italy fragmented into city-states, duchies, and papal lands. Rome itself, though no longer an imperial capital, remained spiritually central as the seat of the papacy, giving the city a new role as the heart of Western Christianity. Pilgrims walked its streets. Scholars studied its ruins. Artists sketched its crumbling arches and imagined the world that once was. Throughout these transformations, the memory of Rome persisted as a guiding light. Every new ruler in Europe, from crowned kings to ambitious emperors, sought legitimacy by tying themselves to Rome's legacy. The very idea of law, citizenship, roads, and urban life carried the imprint of Roman precedent. And in countless monasteries, hidden away in mountain valleys or cloistered in quiet forests, monks carefully copied texts by candlelight, preserving the wisdom of Cicero, Virgil, and Tacitus. The world had changed shape, but the intellectual and cultural DNA of Rome continued its quiet journey into the future. The shadow of Roman engineering also survived. Aqueducts, though broken, inspired new builders. Amphitheaters and bathhouses became quarries for new walls, yet their shapes influenced medieval architecture. Roman bridges lasted centuries, some still carrying travelers across the rivers of Europe. Surveying techniques, administrative methods, military formations, even when adapted, retained echoes of ancient practice. To live in medieval Europe was, in many ways, to live in a world built on Roman foundations. As generations passed, the story of Rome transformed from a political reality into a legend, then into a template for greatness. Writers told tales of Caesar as though he were still present, just beyond the horizon. Emperors were studied as archetypes of power and failure. The fall of the Western Empire became a lesson about the fragility of civilization, the danger of corruption, the unpredictability of migrations, and the limits of even the most enduring human institutions. But it also became a story of renewal, showing how ideas outlive structures and how culture survives, even when empires do not. All the while, Constantinople carried the torch. For nearly 1,000 years after the West's fall, it remained the last echo of the ancient world. Its scholars debated Aristotle while Western Europe struggled through illiteracy. Its libraries housed works long forgotten elsewhere. Its rituals blended Roman ceremony with Christian mysticism, and its walls, towering, layered, and ingenious, held back enemies who would have swept across Europe. But even Constantinople, strong as it was, faced its own fate in the fullness of time. In the centuries after the Western Empire dissolved, Europe entered an age both shadowed and illuminated by Rome's lingering presence. It was a world in transition, where old memories mixed with new ambitions, where the land still bore the bones of Roman roads, fortresses, and great cities. But the voices speaking in its markets and fields came from peoples who had once lived far beyond the empire's frontiers. This was an age of kings who could barely read, ruling from halls filled with tapestries instead of marble. An age of wandering monks, preserving ancient knowledge. An age of wars fought with Roman swords, reforged into new shapes. It was a world that remembered Rome even when it no longer understood it fully. For the people who lived during this time, Rome was not a distant legend. Its ruins stood all around them, broken arches that framed the sky, roofless temples where grass grew between stones, amphitheaters converted into market stalls or makeshift fortresses, and bridges that defied time by still carrying travelers across calm rivers. The grandeur of the past was visible in every cracked column and every fading mosaic. Children played in the remains of bathhouses whose floors once felt the steps of senators. Farmers plowed fields where Roman legions had marched in perfect formation. The land itself seemed to whisper stories of a civilization that had risen higher than any before it. Meanwhile, the Eastern Empire watched from afar, still calling itself Roman, still maintaining a memory of the world that once stretched from Britain to the Nile. Constantinople grew more complex with each passing century, its markets filled with perfumes from Arabia, silk from China, spices from India, and gold from Africa. Its scholars studied ancient manuscripts with meticulous care. Its emperors wore robes woven with shimmering thread, their courts filled with rituals that blended old Roman ceremony with Christian devotion. Yet even this stronghold of the classical world began to feel the pressures of geography and time. To the east, new powers emerged. The Persian Empire challenged Rome repeatedly until both sides understood the weariness of endless war. Later, the rise of Islam brought swift and sweeping change across the Middle East and North Africa. Armies inspired by a new faith moved with astonishing speed, capturing once Roman lands such as Syria, Egypt, and eventually Carthage. The Eastern Roman Empire, what later historians would call Byzantium, held firm for a while, but it was forced to shrink, reorganize, and adopt new strategies for survival. Its remaining territory became a mosaic of fortresses, small farms, and rugged borderlands, defended by soldiers who lived simple lives but carried centuries of imperial tradition in their hearts. Directly across the Mediterranean, Europe itself was transforming. The Franks, under leaders like Clovis and later Charlemagne, built kingdoms on top of Roman provinces. Charlemagne, in particular, dreamed of reviving the old empire. When he was crowned on Christmas Day in the year 800, the old ideas of Roman unity flickered to life again. But his empire, vast though it was, lacked the deep administrative roots that Rome once possessed. It survived him for a time, then fractured into smaller states, each inheriting a piece of the Roman dream. The idea of empire, however, refused to die. It lingered like a spark waiting for air, and throughout Europe, rulers would claim Roman ancestry or authority to bolster their legitimacy. As centuries passed, the Church grew into one of the most powerful institutions in the Western world. Its bishops wore garments inspired by Roman officials. Its rituals took place in basilicas shaped by Roman architectural principles. Its Latin prayers echoed the language of emperors. The Church kept alive not only spiritual teachings, but also fragments of Roman law, philosophy, and memory. In monasteries scattered across green valleys and mountainsides, monks copied manuscripts by candlelight, saving works by Cicero, Livy, Ovid, and countless other thinkers who would otherwise have vanished. Without their steady hands and patient labor, much of Rome's voice would have been lost forever. During this time, Rome itself continued to stand, no longer the center of an empire, but a sacred city whose meaning transformed. Pilgrims arrived from distant lands, drawn by stories of martyrs and saints. They walked streets lined with broken columns, touched stones worn by centuries of footsteps, and prayed in churches built on the foundations of older structures. The city was no longer filled with senators and generals. Instead, it held popes, monks, craftsmen, and travelers. And though it was battered by invasions from Goths, Vandals, and later Lombards, it remained a symbol of continuity in a world that seemed to shift endlessly. In the East, Constantinople remained a glittering capital, proud and ornate, but it too faced constant threats. The empire's borders shrank, expanded, and shrank again like the tide. It fought wars in the Balkans, negotiated alliances in Anatolia, endured plagues, and rebuilt after fires. Through it all, its people held fast to their identity as Romans. They spoke Greek, but they called their home the Roman Empire. They celebrated ancient festivals in new Christian forms. They viewed themselves as inheritors of a civilization that had begun in a small cluster of huts on the banks of the Tiber. But no empire, however enduring, escapes the slow erosion of fate. In the 11th century, the empire suffered a devastating defeat at Manzikert, allowing new powers to flood into Anatolia. Not long afterward, the Crusades, launched from Western Europe with a complex blend of devotion and ambition, changed the region profoundly. For a time, Crusaders and Byzantines were uneasy allies, but misunderstandings festered, and eventually Western forces turned their fury not against distant enemies, but against Constantinople itself. In 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, the capital was sacked. When its walls fell, 1,000 years of history trembled. Libraries burned, treasures vanished, and the empire was split apart. Though the Byzantines eventually reclaimed their capital, the wound never fully healed. The empire limped on for 2 more centuries, weakened and surrounded by rising powers. Among them was the Ottoman Empire, whose ambitions grew steadily. The Ottomans captured territory city by city, fortress by fortress, slowly tightening their grip around Constantinople. Yet the city held, protected by its ancient walls, by its defenders, and by centuries of resilience. Finally, in 1453, after a long siege, Constantinople fell. Cannons pounded its walls, soldiers pressed forward, and the last Roman emperor, Constantine X, fought bravely before disappearing into the chaos. When the city was taken, the final echo of the Roman Empire faded into history. With the fall of Constantinople, a chapter that had begun more than 2,000 years earlier reached its end. But Rome's story did not disappear. It changed shape again. In Renaissance Italy, artists rediscovered ancient sculptures buried beneath centuries of dust. Architects studied the curves of Roman domes and arches to reinvent the beauty of the past. Scholars pored over manuscripts, breathing new life into old texts. The memory of Rome helped ignite new movements in art, science, and philosophy. Across Europe, thinkers compared their own societies to the long history of the Roman world, drawing lessons and warnings from its rise and fall. Even centuries later, Rome remained a benchmark for greatness. Empires from Spain to Britain to Russia looked back to Rome for inspiration. Politicians quoted Roman senators. Generals studied Roman tactics. Poets invoked Roman heroes. In the United States, founders modeled parts of their new republic on Roman ideals, selecting Latin mottos and envisioning a Senate that echoed the ancient one. What Rome had built, its laws, language, engineering, roads, ideas, and stories, did not simply disappear. They became part of the foundation of modern civilization. Rome lived on in the clocks we use, in the alphabets we write, in the buildings we admire, in the legal systems we rely on, and in the stories we tell ourselves about honor, duty, power, and fate. And so even though the Roman Empire fell long ago, its presence surrounds us still, carried quietly through time by the people who inherited its world, sometimes knowingly, sometimes without realizing that the stones beneath their feet, the words in their mouths, or the ideas they hold dear trace back to a city built on 7 hills beside a river in central Italy. Rome's empire ended. Rome's influence never did. It simply shifted, flowed, transformed, and emerged again in the countless shapes of the modern world. In the centuries after the Western Empire dissolved, Europe entered an age both shadowed and illuminated by Rome's lingering presence. It was a world in transition, where old memories mixed with new ambitions, where the land still bore the bones of Roman roads, fortresses, and great cities, but the voices speaking in its markets and fields came from peoples who had once lived far beyond the empire's frontiers. This was an age of kings who could barely read, ruling from halls filled with tapestries instead of marble, an age of wandering monks, preserving ancient knowledge, an age of wars fought with Roman swords, reforged into new shapes. It was a world that remembered Rome, even when it no longer understood it fully. For the people who lived during this time, Rome was not a distant legend. Its ruins stood all around them, broken arches that framed the sky, roofless temples where grass grew between stones, amphitheaters converted into market stalls or makeshift fortresses, and bridges that defied time by still carrying travelers across calm rivers. The grandeur of the past was visible in every cracked column and every fading mosaic. Children played in the remains of bathhouses whose floors once felt the steps of senators. Farmers plowed fields where Roman legions had marched in perfect formation. The land itself seemed to whisper stories of a civilization that had risen higher than any before it. Meanwhile, the Eastern Empire watched from afar, still calling itself Roman, still maintaining a memory of the world that once stretched from Britain to the Nile. Constantinople grew more complex with each passing century, its markets filled with perfumes from Arabia, silk from China, spices from India, and gold from Africa. Its scholars studied ancient manuscripts with meticulous care. Its emperors wore robes woven with shimmering thread, their courts filled with rituals that blended old Roman ceremony with Christian devotion. Yet even this stronghold of the classical world began to feel the pressures of geography and time. To the east, new powers emerged. The Persian Empire challenged Rome repeatedly until both sides understood the weariness of endless war. Later, the rise of Islam brought swift and sweeping change across the Middle East and North Africa. Armies inspired by a new faith moved with astonishing speed, capturing once Roman lands such as Syria, Egypt, and eventually Carthage. The Eastern Roman Empire, what later historians would call Byzantium, held firm for a while, but it was forced to shrink, reorganize, and adopt new strategies for survival. Its remaining territory became a mosaic of fortresses, small farms, and rugged borderlands, defended by soldiers who lived simple lives but carried centuries of imperial tradition in their hearts. Directly across the Mediterranean, Europe itself was transforming. The Franks, under leaders like Clovis and later Charlemagne, built kingdoms on top of Roman provinces. Charlemagne in particular dreamed of reviving the old empire. When he was crowned on Christmas Day in the year 800, the old ideas of Roman unity flickered to life again. But his empire, vast though it was, lacked the deep administrative roots that Rome once possessed. It survived him for a time, then fractured into smaller states, each inheriting a piece of the Roman dream. The idea of empire, however, refused to die. It lingered like a spark waiting for air, and throughout Europe, rulers would claim Roman ancestry or authority to bolster their legitimacy. As centuries passed, the Church grew into one of the most powerful institutions in the Western world. Its bishops wore garments inspired by Roman officials. Its rituals took place in basilicas shaped by Roman architectural principles. Its Latin prayers echoed the language of emperors. The Church kept alive not only spiritual teachings, but also fragments of Roman law, philosophy, and memory. In monasteries scattered across green valleys and mountainsides, monks copied manuscripts by candlelight, saving works by Cicero, Livy, Ovid, and countless other thinkers who would otherwise have vanished. Without their steady hands and patient labor, much of Rome's voice would have been lost forever. During this time, Rome itself continued to stand, no longer the center of an empire, but a sacred city whose meaning transformed. Pilgrims arrived from distant lands, drawn by stories of martyrs and saints. They walked streets lined with broken columns, touched stones worn by centuries of footsteps, and prayed in churches built on the foundations of older structures. The city was no longer filled with senators and generals. Instead, it held popes, monks, craftsmen, and travelers. And though it was battered by invasions from Goths, Vandals, and later Lombards, it remained a symbol of continuity in a world that seemed to shift endlessly. In the east, Constantinople remained a glittering capital, proud and ornate. But it too faced constant threats. The empire's borders shrank, expanded, and shrank again like the tide. It fought wars in the Balkans, negotiated alliances in Anatolia, endured plagues, and rebuilt after fires. Through it all, its people held fast to their identity as Romans. They spoke Greek, but they called their home the Roman Empire. They celebrated ancient festivals in new Christian forms. They viewed themselves as inheritors of a civilization that had begun in a small cluster of huts on the banks of the Tiber. But no empire, however enduring, escapes the slow erosion of fate. In the 11th century, the empire suffered a devastating defeat at Manzikert, allowing new powers to flood into Anatolia. Not long afterward, the Crusades, launched from Western Europe with a complex blend of devotion and ambition, changed the region profoundly. For a time, Crusaders and Byzantines were uneasy allies, but misunderstandings festered, and eventually Western forces turned their fury not against distant enemies but against Constantinople itself. In 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, the capital was sacked. When its walls fell, 1,000 years of history trembled. Libraries burned, treasures vanished, and the empire was split apart. Though the Byzantines eventually reclaimed their capital, the wound never fully healed. The empire limped on for 2 more centuries, weakened and surrounded by rising powers. Among them was the Ottoman Empire, whose ambitions grew steadily. The Ottomans captured territory city by city, fortress by fortress, slowly tightening their grip around Constantinople. Yet the city held, protected by its ancient walls, by its defenders, and by centuries of resilience. Finally, in 1453, after a long siege, Constantinople fell. Cannons pounded its walls, soldiers pressed forward, and the last Roman emperor, Constantine III, fought bravely before disappearing into the chaos. When the city was taken, the final echo of the Roman Empire faded into history. With the fall of Constantinople, a chapter that had begun more than 2,000 years earlier reached its end. But Rome's story did not disappear. It changed shape again. In Renaissance Italy, artists rediscovered ancient sculptures buried beneath centuries of dust. Architects studied the curves of Roman domes and arches to reinvent the beauty of the past. Scholars pored over manuscripts, breathing new life into old texts. The memory of Rome helped ignite new movements in art, science, and philosophy. Across Europe, thinkers compared their own societies to the long history of the Roman world, drawing lessons and warnings from its rise and fall. Even centuries later, Rome remained a benchmark for greatness. Empires from Spain to Britain to Russia looked back to Rome for inspiration. Politicians quoted Roman senators. Generals studied Roman tactics. Poets invoked Roman heroes. In the United States, founders modeled parts of their new republic on Roman ideals, selecting Latin mottos and envisioning a Senate that echoed the ancient one. What Rome had built, its laws, language, engineering, roads, ideas, and stories, did not simply disappear. They became part of the foundation of modern civilization. Rome lived on in the clocks we use, in the alphabets we write, in the buildings we admire, in the legal systems we rely on, and in the stories we tell ourselves about honor, duty, power, and fate. And so, even though the Roman Empire fell long ago, its presence surrounds us still, carried quietly through time by the people who inherited its world, sometimes shaped knowingly, sometimes without realizing that the stones beneath their feet, the words in their mouths, or the ideas they hold dear trace back to a city built on 7 hills beside a river in central Italy. Rome's empire ended. Rome's influence never did. It simply shifted, flowed, transformed, and emerged again in the countless shapes of the modern world. As the centuries moved forward, the shadow of Rome stretched across lands that had never known the empire in its prime. In northern Europe, tribes who once lived in dense forests and wooden villages now built stone churches patterned after basilicas first sketched by Roman architects. In southern Europe, farmers plowed fields along ancient aqueduct channels, their farms depending on water systems designed 1,000 years earlier. In the east, traders crossed routes that Roman merchants had opened long before the world had maps. Rome's memory became a quiet architect, shaping the rhythms of everyday life long after its banners fell. In medieval courts, kings trying to prove their right to rule would trace their ancestry back through tangled lines of genealogy until they reached a Roman name, even when the connection was more poetic than real. A crown, after all, meant little unless it carried the weight of history behind it. And nothing in Europe's memory carried greater weight than Rome, whose rise shaped the world like the turning of an age. Villages that once trembled at the sound of Roman marching feet now told proud stories of how their ancestors had fought or traded with the legions, as though closeness to Rome conferred dignity across time. Even cities founded long after the empire's fall sometimes built their walls along Roman patterns, as if the old empire had drawn invisible blueprints across the continent. In monasteries tucked into cold mountains, monks copying ancient texts would sometimes pause to marvel at the clarity of Roman authors. They found in those pages a disciplined mind, a sense of order, and a fascination with the human condition that transcended era and faith. They copied the works, because they trusted that words could outlive empires, and because Rome's voice was too valuable to lose in the noise of changing centuries. These scribes did not think of themselves as rescuers of civilization. They simply believed that knowledge deserved a witness. Yet their steady hands preserved a lineage of ideas that later generations would rediscover with astonishment. As Europe awakened from the darkest stretches of the Middle Ages, merchants, scholars, and explorers began to travel more widely. Many of them stood among Roman ruins with a sense of awe, realizing that the stones around them came from a world more sophisticated than their own. The Renaissance blossomed in part because artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo looked at ancient sculptures with reverence and wondered how a civilization could command such mastery over form and meaning. They studied Roman proportions, Roman myths, Roman architecture, and Roman philosophy, believing that by reaching back, they could climb forward. And in many ways, they did. Rome, though gone, became a teacher once more. When the age of exploration dawned, European empires declared themselves heirs of Rome's legacy. They carried with them messy mixtures of curiosity, ambition, cruelty, and hope, just as Rome itself had once done. Their ships crossed oceans the Romans never imagined. Their governments claimed territories with the confidence of emperors. Their scholars compared their new experiences with Roman texts, seeking guidance in the words of historians long dead. And though the world they forged often bore little resemblance to the Roman ideal, the influence was impossible to ignore. Roman ideas about law and citizenship, about roads and engineering, about governance and military discipline resurfaced in new and unexpected forms. In the centuries that followed, the memory of Rome moved from the realm of kings and scholars into the imagination of ordinary people. Travelers stood in the Colosseum and felt the weight of time pressing against their skin. Writers compared declining nations to Rome's final days, turning the empire's fall into a cautionary tale about corruption and excess. Philosophers debated why Rome fell and what lessons its collapse offered to societies centuries removed from it. Poets found beauty in ruins covered with ivy, in arches open to the sky, in statues weathered by wind and time. The idea of Rome became both a warning and a wonder, a story of greatness and fragility intertwined. In modern times, archaeologists uncovered layers of Roman life once buried beneath soil and silence. They found military camps that still bore the marks of disciplined construction. They discovered villas with mosaics so vivid they seemed freshly painted. They unearthed letters written on thin slivers of wood, revealing ordinary conversations between soldiers far from home. These finds reminded the world that Rome was not just an empire of emperors, but an empire of people. Merchants, slaves, farmers, artisans, travelers, soldiers, children, all living their lives within a framework that defined their possibilities. Their fragile objects made the empire feel human again. Meanwhile, historians studied Rome's politics with renewed fascination, seeing in its successes and failures echoes of modern states. They noted how Rome thrived when it adapted and crumbled when it clung too tightly to old patterns. They observed how Rome's strength lay not only in its armies, but in its ability to integrate diverse cultures. They analyzed how its economy struggled under inequality, how its politics grew brittle under corruption, how its citizens became disconnected from civic life. For many, Rome became more than a subject of study. It became a mirror reflecting humanity's recurring patterns. Even today, Rome's traces appear in unexpected places. In legal systems that rely on concepts of contracts, rights, and citizenship shaped by Roman thought. In languages that evolved from Latin, spoken now by hundreds of millions across continents, unknown to the ancients. In architecture that borrows Roman arches, columns, and domes to shape its modern skylines. In calendars that follow patterns designed by Roman scholars. In stories told through films, books, and games that draw on Roman heroes, Roman battles, Roman intrigues. The empire may have fallen, but its cultural gravity remains powerful. Standing in Rome today, amid traffic and tourists, it is still possible to feel the past beneath your feet. In the Forum, broken columns cast shadows across stones that once echoed with the voices of senators. In the Pantheon, sunlight pours through the oculus as it did nearly 2,000 years ago, reminding visitors that some creations survive not just because they are strong, but because they are beautiful. Along the Appian Way, ancient paving stones, worn smooth by countless footsteps, stretch toward the horizon. And on Palatine Hill, the crumbling foundations of imperial palaces overlook the city, watching as centuries shift below. Rome's story, its rise, glory, transformation, and fall, continues to inspire because it carries something universal. It speaks to humanity's desire for greatness, its fear of decline, its fascination with power, and its longing for meaning that stretches beyond a single lifetime. It is a story of creation and destruction, of ambition and humility, of order built in a chaotic world. And because the world still wrestles with these same forces, Rome never truly becomes distant. It remains a companion to modern civilization, a reminder that even the mightiest achievements are part of a long, unfolding human story. The empire that once ruled continents has been gone for more than 1,500 years, yet its fingerprints mark countless aspects of our lives. To study Rome is not simply to look backward. It is to understand the roots of many things we take for granted, and so the story continues, retold in books, in classrooms, in quiet documentaries, meant to soothe the mind as it drifts towards sleep. Rome lives on not as a political state, but as a constellation of ideas, memories, and lessons that continue to guide us through time. As the long arc of Rome's story draws toward its quiet end, what remains is not the clamor of armies or the swagger of emperors, but the softer echo of lives lived under a vast and changing sky. The final centuries of the empire did not fall in a single dramatic moment, as legend sometimes suggests. Instead, they drifted downward in stages, subtle shifts in power, gradual changes in expectation, the daily adjustments of millions, as the world they knew slowly reshaped itself. In distant provinces, farmers continued to till their fields, unaware that politicians in Rome debated laws that would barely touch their existence. In coastal towns, fishermen pulled in their nets, just as their ancestors had, caring little whether the city that ruled them was Roman, Gothic, or Byzantine. Most people lived in the margins of great events, yet they carried Rome forward in their habits, in their language, in the quiet repetition of work that sustained civilization. Even as the Western Empire faded, life did not collapse into darkness. Cities adapted. Traders adjusted their routes. Local leaders stepped into roles once managed by Roman officials. The idea of Rome became a memory that guided countless small decisions, A village rebuilding a bridge might model it on a Roman design because the old ways had proved reliable. A scribe copying a legal document might use Latin phrases because they conveyed authority older than any new regime. A family marking the seasons might use a calendar that counted months the Roman way because it helped them plan the year with confidence. Rome's culture became so deeply woven into the fabric of life that its influence survived, even when its institutions vanished. The eastern half of the empire continued to thrive for centuries more, carrying Roman law, Roman architecture, and Roman administration into lands that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. Constantinople grew into a glittering successor, a place where scholars read ancient texts by lamplight and emperors dreamed of reviving Rome's lost territories. In its streets, the spirit of the old empire remained alive, reshaped by time but unmistakable in its ambition. And while the western provinces shifted through waves of migrations and new kingdoms, the East preserved a thread of continuity that kept Rome's memory rooted in the world. Far beyond the empire's old borders, people who had never seen Rome felt its pull. Scholars in the Islamic Golden Age translated Latin works into Arabic and debated them with respect, recognizing in Roman medical texts, philosophical arguments, and engineering manuals a discipline worth preserving. Centuries later, European thinkers carried those same ideas back across borders in yet another translation. Rome became a bridge across cultures, a common reference point in the vast tapestry of human curiosity. Modern nations adopted elements of Roman governance almost without realizing it. The idea that laws should be written, debated, and codified echoes ancient practices first crafted under the Roman Republic. The structure of cities, with grids, forums, and central administrative buildings, follows patterns the Romans perfected: military organization, citizenship rights, legal contracts, and even public infrastructure such as roads and aqueducts bear the imprint of Roman ingenuity. The empire's physical borders dissolved long ago, but its intellectual borders expanded, stretching beyond continents Rome never touched. In the West, centuries after Rome's fall, architects rediscovered the calm geometry of Roman temples and used it to build courthouses, universities, capitals, and libraries. They believed that these shapes carried a dignity worthy of public life. Writers found inspiration in Roman poetry, crafting their own works in the rhythms of Latin verse. Revolutionaries studied Roman history not for nostalgia but for guidance, hoping to understand why great powers rise and why they falter. Rome became a universal metaphor, flexible enough to warn, to teach, and to inspire in equal measure. Today, the ruins that remain are not merely tourist attractions. They are touchstones of memory. A traveler standing inside the Colosseum can feel the pull of millions who once crowded its seats. A visitor walking through Pompeii might sense the fragility of a civilization preserved by tragedy. A wanderer tracing the lines of a Roman road in Britain can imagine soldiers marching under gray skies with orders written in a tongue the locals barely understood. These stones, silent and patient, remind us that the lives shaped by Rome were as complex and vivid as our own. The real gift of Rome's story lies not in its grandeur, but in its humanity. It shows us that civilizations are built brick by brick, law by law, generation by generation. It teaches that empires rise not only through ambition but through cooperation, and that they fall not only through invasion but through neglect. It reveals that Even in the face of decline, people continue to love, to build, to hope, and to dream. The empire's fall was not an ending. It was a transformation, a shift into new eras that carried fragments of Rome forward into many directions. And as the centuries rolled on, Rome became something more than history. It became an anchor of identity, a story humanity tells itself about power, order, creativity, and loss. It became a reminder that even the greatest structures eventually fade, but the ideas behind them can endure far longer than marble and bronze. It became a quiet companion to modern life, whispering through our laws, our architecture, our languages, and our imagination. In the end, the entire story of the Roman Empire is not a tale of a fallen state, but a tale of continuity. A world shaped by roads that still run straight, by words still spoken in new forms, by laws that still echo ancient reasoning, by ruins that still draw crowds who marvel at what humans once made. Rome's greatness lies not in its conquests, but in its resilience. It remains present everywhere, in our institutions, our culture, and our sense of what civilization means. And as this long journey through Rome's history draws to a gentle close, the mind drifts into a space between memory and rest. The empire fades into the soft distance of time, a vast landscape of triumphs and tragedies, of artists and soldiers, of emperors and citizens, of voices recorded in stone and whispers carried by dust. The story quiets, but does not vanish. It settles like a calm breath at the end of a long day, inviting sleep with the reassurance that even the mightiest rise and fall in rhythms older than any single life. Rome sleeps now, and so may you.